Ryan Mercer spent his last $10,000 to buy Silence, an abandoned farmhouse on Ridgeline Road, miles outside Pine Haven in Bryan County, Montana. He didn't come here to be found. He came here to stop waking up with war still burning behind his eyes. But when he returned weeks later, the valley was frozen, and smoke was rising from a chimney that shouldn't work. Someone had been living inside his ruin. A young woman named Grace Hayes, shaking but defiant. And beside her, Rex, a German shepherd trained to search, to guard, and to never look away. Grace whispered one sentence that changed everything. "Please don't call the sheriff." Because her father died 3 months ago in a car accident, after he refused to sign off on Summit Terra's resort project. And somewhere on this property, under snow and rot and old timber, he hid proof he never lived long enough to deliver. Rex already knows where it is. The question is, when the law is bought, what does a good man do next? If you're watching tonight, tell me where you're watching from. And stay with me. This story ends with the truth coming into the light. By late spring, people in Bryan County would drive up Ridgeline Road just to see the farmhouse that used to lean like a tired man. A small sign would hang on the porch, and a German shepherd named Rex would walk the hallway in a blue service harness as if he had always been built for peace. But that was later. This began in the dead center of a Montana winter, when the valley was white, quiet, and sharp enough to cut. Before we begin, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from. And if stories about loyalty, courage, and second chances matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter. Ryan Mercer brought his old pickup up the rutted track and killed the engine at the ridge. The silence that followed was the kind he'd paid for. No traffic, no neighbors, no voices. Just wind through pines and the soft hiss of snow. That silence was why he bought this place. 38, ex-Navy SEAL, and still fighting a war that didn't show up on any map. Sleep came in fragments. Memories came like shrapnel. He had learned that distance was the only thing that sometimes lowered the volume. So, he bought 10 forgotten acres outside Pine Haven and a farmhouse nobody wanted, planning to fix the roof, mend the fences, and keep his past at arm's length. He stepped out, pulled his coat tight, and looked up at the house. Smoke rose from the chimney. Ryan froze. He'd inspected the fireplace himself in the fall. The flue was clogged with soot and nests. The damper barely moved. It shouldn't be breathing. His hand went to the inside pocket of his coat anyway. Habit, not drama. He scanned the yard. Near his truck, the snow was clean. Closer to the porch, faint tracks crossed the drift. One set of careful boot prints, one set of paws. Someone had been coming and going. Ryan moved up the driveway, slow, testing each porch board with his weight. The wood groaned in complaint. A curtain inside the front window trembled, then went still. He didn't call out. He listened. A floorboard creaked inside. Then silence returned, too deliberate to be comfort. The door handle was rimmed with frost. Ryan tried it, unlocked. He pushed the door open a few inches. Warm air slid out across his face. Firelight flickered in the hallway. And from deeper inside, the house came a low sound. Uncertain, not quite a growl and not quite a warning. Ryan stepped in, letting the cold shut behind him. The living room wasn't how he'd left it. The floor had been swept. Firewood was stacked in a neat line. A broken window had been patched with cardboard and duct tape. Blankets were folded near the hearth, like someone cared what the room looked like, even when no one was supposed to see it. Near the fireplace, a young woman stood frozen with a tin cup in both hands. Early 20s, maybe 24. Chestnut hair falling loose, cheeks pale from winter and worry. Her coat hung too big, as if it had been borrowed in a hurry. Her eyes stayed on Ryan, hazel green, scared and stubborn enough to hold a line. At her side stood a German shepherd, about 2 years old by the look of him. Thick winter coat, black and tan. His muscles were tight, ears pinned back. A low growl rolled in his chest like thunder held underwater. Ryan lifted one empty hand, palm open. He kept his voice low, steady, and plain. "Easy." The dog's eyes followed Ryan's hands with intelligence that made Ryan respect him immediately. This wasn't a stray. This was a working dog who had been taught to decide what danger looked like. The woman swallowed hard. "Please," she said, and the word sounded like it cost her. "Please don't call the sheriff." That landed like a stone. Ryan kept his gaze on the dog, not wanting to escalate. "This place is mine." Her shoulders flinched. Then she straightened as if refusing to fold. "I didn't know anyone owned it," she said quickly. "We'll leave. We just needed somewhere warm." "We?" Ryan let his eyes move over the room again. Clean, orderly, survival without trash, someone trying to stay human. "How long?" he asked. "A few nights." "What's your name?" She hesitated, then answered softly. "Grace." Ryan nodded once. "And him?" Her hand found the dog's neck, fingers buried in fur like it was an anchor. "Rex!" At his name, the growl dipped lower, still present but less sharp. Rex didn't look away from Ryan. He looked like a door that would not open without Grace's permission. Ryan set his tool bag down slowly, a deliberate, non-threatening motion. Rex tracked it, then tracked Ryan again. Grace's eyes flicked toward the door and back, measuring distance, exits, chances. Ryan recognized the posture. He'd worn it himself. When you don't trust the world to let you leave. "You got somewhere else to go?" he asked. Grace shook her head. "No." "You got family in Pine Haven?" Her jaw tightened. "No." That answer was too fast. A wall slammed down behind it, and Ryan could feel the story waiting there, trapped. Outside, wind pushed snow against the patch window. Inside, the fire popped and threw a brief spray of sparks. Ryan exhaled, slow, letting his shoulders loosen on purpose. He didn't owe strangers anything. He also knew what it meant to be cornered by cold. "You can stay tonight," he said. Not kindness disguised as charity, more like a decision. "But tomorrow, we talk about what comes next." Grace blinked as if she hadn't expected an offer to come with boundaries. Relief flickered across her face, then fear rushed back in to replace it, like she didn't trust relief to last. "Thank you," she whispered anyway. Rex lowered himself near the hearth, but he didn't rest. His ears twitched, not at the fire, but toward the back of the property, toward the dark line of trees and the old barn Ryan had barely looked at when he bought the place. Ryan followed the dog's attention and felt his own instincts tighten. Rex wasn't just watching Ryan. Rex was waiting, like he knew the farmhouse wasn't the real hiding place. "If you're watching tonight, tell me where you're watching from." Storms feel smaller when we're not alone in them. Ryan expected the farmhouse to feel like his again once the door shut. Instead, it felt like a room holding its breath. Grace stayed close to the hearth, both hands wrapped around a tin cup long after it stopped steaming. Rex lay at her feet, but his eyes never closed. Every few minutes his head turned toward the back windows and the dark shape of old coal barn beyond the snow. Ryan recognized that kind of watchfulness. He'd worn it through deserts and city blocks, then brought it home like a disease. He kept his movements slow, set his bag down, warmed a can of soup, slid a bowl across the table without pushing it into her space. Grace ate like someone who'd learned hunger was safer than trust. When the room finally settled into a shaky quiet, Ryan said, "You told me not to call the sheriff." Grace's shoulders tightened. "Sheriff Dale Hargrove doesn't help people, he moves them." "In small towns, sheriffs move drunks and lost tourists," Ryan said. "Why would he move you?" Grace stared at the fire, as if it could swallow the answer. "Because my dad wouldn't sign what they wanted." Ryan's voice stayed even. "Your dad." "Evan Hayes," she said. "Civil engineer. Summit Terra Development hired him for their new eco-resort down by Frozen Elk River." Ryan had seen the billboard outside Pine Haven. Smiling families, clean water, the promise of jobs. Grace's mouth twisted. "It isn't clean. Dad found a pipeline. Waste diversion under the snow line. Chemical runoff into the river. He refused to sign the final report." Rex's ears twitched, like his name was a command he'd been waiting for. Grace went on, faster now, as if once the dam broke she had to get it out before courage failed. "Dad started getting calls, strange trucks sitting across from our driveway. He went to the county office, tried to report it. Mayor Curtis Bain told him he was confusing people and needed to stop." Ryan felt his jaw set, but he didn't interrupt. 3 months ago, Grace said, they said he hit black ice on Ridgeline Road and rolled into a ditch. Her eyes lifted to Ryan, wet, furious. His tires were new. He'd just serviced the truck. He didn't just slide off the world. Ryan let the silence stretch, the way he'd learned to in debriefs. Let people fill it with what mattered. Grace's voice softened, and that softness hurt more than anger. After the funeral, bills came, hospital, towing, investigation fees, $50,000 of debt that didn't make sense. Then someone broke into our house. Nothing stolen, just drawers opened, papers gone. Yeah, Ryan's SEAL instincts clicked through it. Intimidation, search, pressure. And you went to Hargrove? Grace shook her head once. Hargrove came to me, told me to take my grief and go home. Told me Rex was dangerous and I should keep him leashed, like he was warning me, not protecting anyone. She reached down and pressed her palm into Rex's thick fur. The dog stayed still, steady, the only thing in the room that seemed unafraid. That night Rex wouldn't stop pacing, Grace whispered. He kept scratching at our shed, whining like he was trying to tell me something. Then a black SUV rolled past, twice. After that, I didn't sleep. I just listened. Ryan felt the echo of that word, listen, settle into his bones. It was the same way he'd lived since he came back from war, not living, really, waiting. So you ran, he said. I packed what I could, grabbed Rex, and drove until the road turned to nothing, Grace said. I remembered this place was listed as abandoned, far from Pine Haven. I thought the snow would hide us. Ryan looked around the room, the patched window, the stacked wood, the swept floor. She wasn't reckless, she was surviving. He didn't owe her anything. He also knew what it did to a person to be left alone with fear long enough. Tonight you sleep, Ryan said. I'll take the chair by the door. Grace blinked. Why? Ryan hesitated. The honest answer was too big. Because he knew what it was to be cornered and unseen. Because if he turned her out, he'd hear it in his own nightmares. Instead, he said, because it's a storm, because you're here, that's enough for one night. The wind battered the farmhouse until the boards complained. Ryan dozed in shallow bursts. In the dark, he heard Rex move. Quiet paws checking locks, window seams, corners. A patrol. Near dawn, the world outside turned the color of old steel. Ryan stared out through the patched cardboard. No headlights, no tracks, just snow, and the barn's crooked silhouette. Grace woke hard, scanning for danger. When she realized she was still safe, she exhaled like she'd been holding air for months. Ryan handed her a mug of instant coffee. Tell me what you still have, he said. Grace shook her head. Dad's notes were on his laptop. It's gone. She swallowed. But he said, if anything happened, Rex would know where to go. At that, Rex stood and walked to the back door. He looked over his shoulder at Grace, then at Ryan. Tail stiff, ears forward, working. Ryan felt something shift, not hope, purpose. Show me, he said. They stepped into the morning cold. Snow bit at their faces. Rex moved ahead, nose down, threading a path through drifts like he'd done it before. He didn't head toward the road. He headed straight for Old Coal Barn. Up close, the barn looked worse. Timbers blackened, roof half collapsed. A mouth full of shadow. Rex stopped at the entrance and gave one short bark, clean and certain. Grace's voice trembled. Dad used to bring Rex here when he was training, years ago, before Summit Terra. Ryan scanned the tree line. Then someone else could remember it too. Rex tracked along the back wall, sniffing, then stiffened. His claws scraped wood, once, twice, harder. He barked again and dug at a section where the boards looked darker, almost oily. Ryan crouched, flashlight cutting through the barn's dust and gloom. That wood wasn't just old, it looked preserved, hidden on purpose. Ryan met Grace's eyes. Get behind me, he said. Then he slid his knife under the edge of the board and began to pry. Rex didn't scratch at random. In the dim belly of Old Coal Barn, he chose one section of wall and worked it like he'd been given an address, nose pressed to the wood, claws scraping, one sharp bark that sounded almost like a command. Ryan Mercer stepped in front of Grace Hayes without thinking. Stay behind me. Grace's breath fogged in the lantern light. Rex, good boy, show us. The boards Rex attacked looked different, darker, slightly glossy, as if someone had rubbed them with oil. Ryan slid his knife under the edge and pried. The first nail squealed free. The barn groaned. Rex didn't flinch. Ryan levered again. The board loosened and finally gave way, revealing a narrow cavity packed with straw and wrapped cloth. He reached in carefully and pulled out a small wooden box, slick with old oil, heavier than it looked. Rusted hinges, a strip of cloth tied tight around the lid. Grace dropped to her knees, hands shaking. That looks like my dad's. You recognize it? Ryan asked. She nodded, swallowing hard. He used boxes like that for papers he didn't want ruined? He said water makes the truth disappear. Rex sat beside her, alert and proud, as if he'd delivered something sacred. Ryan cut the cloth and lifted the lid. Inside, bundles of waxed paper were tied with twine. He peeled back the first layer, my maps, receipts, photographs, and on top, a blueprint marked with red pen. Grace leaned in, eyes widening as she read. That's the valley, and that's the construction zone. Ryan traced a thick line running from Summit Terra's site toward Frozen Elk River. Next to several junctions, Evan Hayes' handwriting repeated the same words. Waste diversion. Grace's mouth opened, then closed. He was right. Ryan flipped the next papers. Invoices stamped with Summit Terra Development's logo. Chemical names, barrel counts, dates, enough to show this wasn't one mistake, but a system. At the bottom was a photograph. A flatbed truck under floodlights, hauling sealed drums. In the corner, a note written by hand. Valve runs warm, even in February. Below it, the signature. Evan Hayes. Grace covered her mouth. Tears slipped down her cheeks, quiet and unstoppable. He hid it here, she whispered. He really did. Ryan found an envelope tucked under the photos, edges curled from damp. On the front, for Grace. If I don't come home. Grace stared at it like it could burn her. I can't. You don't have to read it alone, Ryan said, and held it steady until she took it. She opened it with shaking fingers. The letter was short, direct. Evan wrote that he'd tried the honest way, that he no longer trusted the county, that Rex would remember where the proof was hidden, and one line, underlined twice. If you're reading this, it means someone decided the truth was worth killing for. Grace folded the paper to her chest and leaned into Rex. Rex stayed still, letting her borrow his strength. Ryan scanned the barn, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. Why this place? He asked quietly. Dad trained Rex here, Grace said. He brought him to this barn when Rex was learning scent work. Dad said if anything happened, Rex would know where to go. Ryan looked at the dog. Rex stared back, steady, as if to say, I did my part, now do yours. Grace's anger finally sharpened. They called it black ice. Sheriff Dale Hargrove told me to stop asking questions. Her voice cracked. But Dad died for this. Ryan closed the box and pulled it close. Then we don't hand it to Hargrove. Who do we give it to? Grace asked, fear returning. We don't give it away yet, Ryan said. We make it undeniable. He tapped the photo with the note. Your dad left us a lead, a valve, a river. Grace looked down at the map again. Frozen Elk River. Ryan nodded. If the pipeline is active, it will leave a signature. Heat, smell, runoff. We photograph it. We mark coordinates. Proof the county can't pretend it doesn't see. Grace's eyes darted toward the barn door. They'll come for this. Ryan's voice dropped. That's why you ran, and that's why we moved before they realize what's missing. Rex stood and walked to the barn entrance, ears forward, watching the snowy yard like a sentry. They hurried back to the farmhouse. Ryan laid the box on the kitchen table and packed fast. Flashlight, batteries, a camera, a small first aid kit. He handed Grace a spare coat, warm and too big, and watched her pull it on like armor. Rex paced from door to window, nose lifting at every faint sound. The dog wasn't panicking, he was counting. Ryan tucked the evidence box into a blanket and slid it behind the seat. Then he looked at Grace. If anything goes bad, he said, you get in the truck and you don't argue. Grace swallowed. And you? Ryan didn't answer the way she wanted. He answered like a man who had finally chosen a side. You listen to me, he said. That's how we both make it. Grace nodded once. Okay. Rex jumped into the back without being told, turning once before sitting upright, eyes forward. Ryan started the engine. Outside, the sky was thickening with cloud, promising another storm. We go now, Ryan said. They drove down Ridgeline Road, the farmhouse shrinking behind them, and the world widening into white hills and frozen timber. And when the road finally dipped toward the valley, where Frozen Elk River cut its dark line through the snow, Rex rose in the back seat, ears pricked, ready to show them exactly what Evan Hayes had meant. The farther they drove from the farmhouse, the more the world felt like a blank page. White hills, gray sky, pines bent under snow. It should have been peaceful. Ryan Mercer knew better. Silence wasn't safety. Silence was what happened right before something moved. Grace Hayes sat rigid in the passenger seat, both hands locked around the folded map from Evan Hayes' box. She kept checking the windshield like she expected a set of headlights to appear behind them, cutting through the snow like a warning. Rex rode in the back, upright and still, not anxious, focused. His nose lifted now and then, tasting the air through the crack in the window, reading the valley in a language humans couldn't hear. Ryan kept the truck slow on the icy curves of Ridgeline Road. He didn't need speed, he needed control. They reached the overlook above Frozen Elk River just before dusk. The clouds hung low, turning the light flat and metallic. Down below, the river cut a dark ribbon through the white. The ice fractured in long plates that looked like broken glass. Ryan killed the engine. For a second, the only sound was the ticking of the motor cooling and the wind pressing against the doors. Grace whispered, "This is where Dad marked the junction." Ryan nodded. "We do this clean. Photos, coordinates, then we leave." He stepped out first, cold biting through his gloves. Grace followed, boots crunching in crusted snow. Rex jumped down and immediately lowered his head, nose sweeping the ground in tight arcs. The dog moved with purpose, not curiosity. He crossed the slope and paused near a cluster of half-buried pipes at the river's edge. His tail stiffened. Then he barked, one sharp sound that snapped through the wind. Ryan's stomach tightened. He hurried over. The smell hit first. Not the clean scent of snow or pine, but something metallic, sour, wrong. It reminded Ryan of places overseas where water shouldn't have been touched. Grace gagged and turned her face away. "Oh my God!" Along the bank, fish lay frozen in the slush, gray bellies up, eyes glazed. Farther up the slope, a deer's body was half buried, twisted as if it had tried to run and simply failed. Ryan crouched near the nearest pipe. Frost coated a rusted valve. He scraped it with his knife. The metal underneath wasn't just exposed, it was warm. Ryan held his gloved hand close and felt the heat bleeding through. "Active," he murmured. Grace's eyes filled. "They're still dumping." Ryan pulled his camera from his coat and began taking photos with methodical calm. Wide shots of the riverbank, the dead wildlife, the pipes, the valve, the surrounding terrain. Then close-ups of the stamped metal fittings and the residue staining the snow. Grace took out her phone and marked coordinates, fingers shaking so hard she had to try twice. "Dad was right," she whispered. "He died, and they didn't even stop." Rex paced a tight circle near the valve, nose twitching, then backed up and sat, watching the tree line like he could feel the valley's eyes on them. Ryan didn't like that. He scanned the ridge above the river. Nothing. Just pines and drifting snow. But he'd learned long ago that nothing could still be someone waiting. 2 minutes, he told Grace. Then we go. Grace forced herself to breathe and kept recording. Short video, slow pan, voice narration naming the location. Frozen Elk River, Briar County, Summit Terra Pipes, date and time. Her voice broke. She swallowed and kept talking anyway. When Ryan was satisfied, he stood. Back to the truck. They climbed the slope, Rex staying close to Grace's side, his body angled between her and the open valley. Protective, disciplined, like he'd been trained for exactly this. The drive back to Ridgeline Road felt longer. The wind strengthened. Snow thickened in the headlights. The sky turned the color of bruised steel. By the time they pulled into the farmhouse yard, night had fully settled. Inside, Grace moved straight to the table and opened her laptop. Ryan set the evidence box beside her and checked the windows, the locks, the patched cardboard. "Who do we send it to?" Grace asked, fingers hovering above the keyboard. Ryan leaned over the map. "Your father didn't trust the county. We don't either. We need someone outside Briar County, someone who can publish fast." Grace hesitated. I know one name. An environmental journalist, Maya Cortez, Denver." Ryan nodded. "That's our door." Grace's hands shook as she composed the email. She attached the photos, the coordinates, the video. She wrote a short statement. Evan Hayes discovered illegal dumping. He was threatened. He died. Summit Terra continues. Tonight we were attacked. She paused, then looked at Ryan. We weren't attacked, Ryan said quietly. Not yet. Grace swallowed and typed, We found proof. We fear retaliation. She encrypted the message, triple-checked the attachments, and hit send. For a moment, the farmhouse felt lighter, as if the truth had moved out of their hands and into the world. Then Rex's head lifted. His ears snapped forward. A low growl rolled up from his chest, deep enough to vibrate the floorboards. Ryan froze. Grace whispered, What is it? Rex stood and moved to the window, posture stiff, nose pressed toward the glass. He didn't bark again. He listened. Outside, faint at first, then brighter, light moved across the snow. Two beams, swinging through the storm, cutting across the fence line. Headlights. Ryan killed the lamp with one motion, plunging the room into darkness. He grabbed Grace by the shoulder and pulled her down behind the couch. Quiet, he breathed. The lights stopped at the gate. Then another set pulled in behind them. Two vehicles. Rex's growl deepened, but he held position, waiting for Ryan's signal. Ryan felt his pulse slow into that cold, controlled place he used to enter before a breach. He didn't want to fight, but the valley didn't care what he wanted. A shadow moved outside the front window. Then the sound came, sharp, sudden, final. Glass shattering into the night. The first window blew inward with a brittle crack, and for half a second the farmhouse sounded like it was exhaling glass. Grace Hayes flinched so hard her shoulder struck the couch. Ryan Mercer already had her down behind it, one hand firm at the back of her neck. Not rough, just certain. Stay low, he breathed. Rex stood between them and the shattered window, body rigid, teeth bared. A low growl rolling so deep it vibrated the floorboards. In the weak spill of moonlight off the snow, the dog looked carved from shadow and instinct. Outside, the storm hadn't fully died. Wind shoved snow against the patched cardboard, and headlights painted the walls in sweeping bands. Two vehicles. Ryan could feel the weight of them out there like pressure in his ears. A boot crunched on the porch, then another. Someone tried the handle. Slow, testing. Like they expected the door to be locked. When it gave, the door opened in a careful inch, and a thin wedge of cold air slid into the room. Ryan didn't move. He listened. Two sets of breathing. One heavier, one quick. A faint metallic click. Crowbar against wood, or a weapon being shifted. He tasted that old feeling, the one he hated. Focus so sharp, it made everything else disappear. The door opened wider. A flashlight beam cut through the dark, skimming over the floor, the table, the hearth. The first man stepped in wearing a dark parka with the hood pulled low. His boots were clean, not the boots of a drifter. The second followed, keeping his shoulder tight to the doorframe, moving with practiced caution. Not kids, not thieves, clean up. Rex lunged before either man fully understood what they were walking into. The German Shepherd hit the first intruder at chest height, a blur of muscle and winter fur. The man grunted and stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. The beam spun across the ceiling like a panicked eye. "Get him off!" the man shouted, voice muffled by his hood. Rex clamped onto the sleeve of his parka and drove forward, forcing him into the wall. Not wild, targeted, controlled. The second intruder swung toward the dog. Ryan moved. He crossed the room low and fast, grabbed the man's wrist, and knocked the weapon line away in one motion. He didn't need to think about it. His body remembered the geometry of close quarters, even when his mind begged him to forget. The intruder tried to wrench free. Ryan stepped inside the movement and drove an elbow into the man's ribs. Air left him in a sharp burst. Ryan shoved him down hard onto the floorboards and pinned him there with weight and leverage. Grace's breath came in tight, shallow pulls behind the couch. Ryan didn't look back. He trusted Rex to hold the first man. He trusted himself to end the second. "Don't," Ryan said, voice flat, not raised. "Not in my house." The intruder's eyes flashed in the darkness. "You don't know who you're messing with." Ryan tightened his grip. "Then explain it." The man spat, and the sound was thick with fear, trying to dress itself as bravado. "We're just here to pick something up," Rex snarled, and the first intruder yelped as the dog's teeth tightened on fabric. Ryan's gaze flicked toward the wall, then back to the man on the floor. "The box," he said, not a question. The intruder's face tightened. "You found it." A cold clarity settled over Ryan. They weren't guessing. They knew exactly what was hidden on this property, and they knew someone had moved it. Ryan pushed down just enough to remind the man he couldn't move. "Who sent you?" The intruder hesitated. Rex's growl deepened. The first man, still pinned near the wall, wheezed, "Just tell him, man, tell him." The second intruder swallowed. "Sheriff." Grace's head lifted behind the couch, eyes wide. "Sheriff Dale Hargrove." The intruder's gaze snapped to her voice, and Ryan felt the shift, the calculation, the recognition. The man's eyes narrowed as if he'd seen her picture somewhere. That alone made Ryan's blood go cold. Ryan kept his voice controlled. "Say his name again." "Hargrove," the intruder muttered. He said the girl took something that belonged to Summit Terra. He said bring it back and there'd be cash. No questions. Grace made a sound, half sob, half laugh, with no humor in it. "My dad is dead, and he still won't let it go." Ryan didn't let the intruder see his reaction, but something inside him hardened into a clean edge. "How many people did he send?" he asked. "Just us," the man said too quickly. Rex snapped his head toward the doorway and barked once, short, sharp. Ryan's eyes flicked to the window, headlights still, engine noise low, waiting, not just us. Ryan pressed the intruder's wrist until he winced. "You're lying," the man grimaced. There's a third in the truck, Spotter. He's supposed to radio if anything goes bad." Ryan's jaw tightened. That meant they were on a clock. A spotter didn't wait long before calling for help, and the help in Briar County wore badges. Ryan didn't call the sheriff. He couldn't, not if Hargrove was the one pulling strings. He glanced back at Grace. "Phone," he said quietly. "Record." Grace scrambled, hands shaking, but she understood. She lifted her phone and hit record, keeping it low so the intruders wouldn't see the screen reflection. Ryan turned back to the man on the floor. "Say it clearly," he ordered. "Who hired you?" The intruder swallowed, eyes darting toward the door as if he could already feel consequences. Then fear won. "Sheriff Dale Hargrove hired us. He said Summit Terra would pay if we brought back the box from Old Coal Barn." Ryan nodded once. "And why does Summit Terra want it?" The man licked his lips. "Because it proves they're dumping into Frozen Elk River. Because the mayor's in on it. Because it's the kind of thing that gets people arrested." Grace's breath hitched. Her phone captured every syllable. Ryan shifted his weight, reached into the intruder's jacket, and pulled out a cheap radio. On the belt clip was a small tag, scratched and worn, but readable. Pine Haven Security Contract. Ryan's eyes lifted to Grace. "Summit Terra has local contracts," he said low. "That's why this town feels sealed." The radio crackled. "Status?" a voice asked, distorted. "You in?" Ryan held the radio close, but didn't answer. "Status," the voice repeated, sharper now. "Hargrove wants the box tonight." Grace's face went pale. Ryan clicked the radio off and set it aside. He looked at Rex. "Easy," he whispered. "Oak." Rex released the first intruder's sleeve and backed up half a step, still ready, still staring. The first man slid down the wall, clutching his arm, cursing under his breath, more frightened than hurt. Ryan bound both intruders with rope from his toolkit. Not elegant, just effective. He kept them on the floor where he could see them. Grace stood now, trembling but upright. Her eyes locked on the men like she wanted to burn their faces into memory. "They sent you to erase my father again," she said. The first intruder laughed harshly. "Lady, your father erased himself when he thought he could fight Summit Terra." Ryan's voice cut through the room, quiet and lethal. "You don't get to talk about him." The intruder's grin faltered. Ryan turned to Grace. "Upload the recording," he said. "Send it to Maya Cortez, now." Grace's fingers flew across the keyboard, tears blurring her vision. She attached the confession to the email thread, added a single line. "They came tonight. Sheriff sent them," and hit send. For one breathless second, the farmhouse held still. Then Rex's ears snapped toward the back window, and his growl returned, lower than before. Outside, somewhere beyond the porch, an engine shifted. Snow crunched. A door opened and shut. The spotter had left the truck, and he was walking toward the house. The spotter didn't rush the farmhouse. He approached like a man who'd done this before. Slow steps on the porch, a pause by the shattered window, then the soft scrape of something metal testing the frame. Inside, Ryan Mercer held his breath and kept the room black. Grace Hayes crouched behind the couch with Rex pressed tight to her side. She had one hand on the dog's collar, not to restrain him, but to keep his first move on Ryan's signal. Ryan had two intruders zip-tied on the kitchen floor. Their radio sat on the table, switched off. He didn't need the noise to tell him what was coming. A beam of light swept through the broken window. It stopped on the floor, then lifted, slow, searching for shapes. The spotter's voice came through the glass, casual on purpose. "Hey, you guys in there?" No answer. The flashlight beam moved again. Ryan stepped into the kitchen shadow and picked up the radio, thumb hovering over the power. If the spotter called the sheriff now, this would become official in about 5 minutes. Sirens, badges, a warrant, and a story that would bury Grace and erase her father a second time. Rex's ears pinned forward. His growl rose, not loud, controlled. Ryan whispered, "Hold." The spotter's silhouette shifted at the doorway. He tried the knob and found it unlocked. The door creaked open, letting in a sliver of wind and snow. He stepped into the hallway. Rex stayed still, trembling with restraint, like a coiled spring. The spotter angled his light toward the living room, then toward the kitchen. He saw the broken glass, the dark shapes, the absence of his men. His breath changed. Ryan came out of the darkness and said, quiet and steady, "Drop it." The spotter spun. Too late. Ryan was already inside his reach. One hard, clean movement. The flashlight knocked aside. The wrist turned, the man's balance taken from him as if gravity had been rewired. The spotter hit the floor with a grunt. Rex surged forward with a snarl that shook the walls. "Off!" Ryan commanded. Rex stopped one step short of the man's throat, teeth bared, eyes burning. He didn't bite. That control told Ryan everything about how Evan Hayes had raised this dog, courage without chaos. The spotter looked at Rex, then at Ryan, and his bravado collapsed into something smaller. "You're making a mistake." Ryan kept a knee on the man's shoulder. "You're going to tell me who you report to." The spotter's jaw clenched. Rex growled once, lower, closer. The man swallowed. "Sheriff Dale Hargrove!" Grace's voice cracked from behind the couch. "He sent you to finish it." The spotter glanced toward her, recognition flickering. "He said you'd run." Ryan zip-tied the spotter's hands and pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen lit with unread messages. "Hargrove, get the box, no exceptions." "Hargrove, if the dog gets in the way, handle it." "Hargrove, sunrise, or I clean this up myself." Grace stared at the words as if they were a second death notice. Her face went white. He wrote that about Rex." Ryan's voice stayed calm, but something in his eyes hardened. "This isn't just corruption," he said. "It's command and control." He looked at Grace. "Laptop, now." Grace moved to the table, hands shaking as she opened the email thread with Maya Cortez. The confession recording was already attached. The river photos and coordinates were already sent. But Ryan knew sent wasn't the same as safe. "Attach these screenshots," he said, and slid Hargrove's messages across to her. Grace's fingers hovered. What if they intercepted? Ryan's mind worked in straight lines. Then we make it impossible to intercept. He wrote one sentence for Grace to copy and paste, keeping it short so it would load even on weak signal. "If we go dark, publish everything." Hargrove ordered it in writing. Grace hit send. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a small notification appeared. Delivered. Grace's shoulders sagged like a cord had snapped. Ryan didn't relax. "Delivered means the message left your hands," he said, "not that it landed somewhere safe." Rex moved to the window, watching the snow beyond the porch, listening to the valley's heartbeat. In the kitchen, the intruders shifted against their restraints, cursing under their breath, suddenly aware they were no longer the hunters. Ryan kept his voice low. "We hold until daylight," he told Grace. "Then we decide." Dawn came thin and gray, the kind of light that made everything look guilty. Grace was wiping her eyes when Rex's body stiffened again. Different this time. Not the warning of one man. Many. Ryan looked through the cracked curtain. 2 patrol SUVs rolled into the yard, tires crunching through snow. Another followed, badges on the doors, Pine Haven. And behind them, a truck without markings, dark, official, and wrong. Grace's voice dropped to a whisper. "That's him!" Sheriff Dale Hargrove stepped out of the lead SUV as if he owned the land and the air above it. He was broad, confident, and smiling the way people smile when they're used to being obeyed. Deputy lights reflected in the ice like cold applause. Hargrove approached the porch, looked at the broken window, and raised his voice just enough to sound reasonable. "Ryan Mercer," he called. "Come out and we'll keep this civil." Ryan didn't answer. Hargrove tried again, louder. "We've got reports of assault. 2 contractors attacked. You're harboring a trespasser. And that dog—" He paused, like he was choosing words for the record. "That dog is dangerous." Grace's hand tightened on Rex's collar. "He's lying." Ryan's eyes stayed on Hargrove. "He's writing the story," he said quietly. "Same way he wrote your father's death." Hargrove's smile sharpened. "Last chance. Open the door." Ryan stepped closer to the entryway, but kept the chain on. He spoke through the crack, voice flat and controlled. "Your men confessed, your spotter is inside, and I have your messages." A flicker crossed Hargrove's face, fast, then gone. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to something almost friendly. "Son," he said, "this county doesn't care what you think you have." Ryan looked him straight in the eyes. "Then it's a good thing the county isn't the only audience?" For one long beat, the wind was the only sound. Then Ryan heard it, faint at first, like distant thunder on a clear day. Not sirens, engines, more vehicles coming up Ridgeline Road. But these weren't Pine Haven cruisers. These were unmarked SUVs moving with purpose, tires biting hard, no hesitation. Hargrove heard them too. His posture changed. His head turned, just slightly, as if he couldn't stop himself. Grace whispered, "Who is that?" Ryan didn't smile, but his voice softened with certainty. "That," he said, "is what happens when the truth leaves Briar County." The lead unmarked SUV stopped behind the sheriff's line. A man in a dark coat stepped out and held up a folder. "Sheriff Dale Hargrove," the man called. "Federal warrant." For a second, Hargrove stood very still. Then he shifted into performance. Hands up. Indignation. Outrage. But the deputies didn't move the way they used to, because performance only works when the crowd is paid. Grace's breath hitched. Rex stood tall beside her, ears forward, watching the yard like he was watching a storm finally turn. Hargrove glanced back once, eyes cold, and Ryan saw it clearly. This wasn't surrender, it was calculation. And calculation meant one thing. Even handcuffed, Hargrove would still try to take something from them. Grace looked at Ryan, voice trembling with equal parts fear and relief. "What do we do now?" Ryan watched federal agents step onto the porch, watched the first set of handcuffs click, watched the lie finally meet a wall. Then he looked down at the farmhouse, the broken window, the patched cardboard, the evidence box that had turned into a fuse. "We don't just survive," he said. "We build something they can't erase." Grace blinked. "Here?" Ryan nodded once. "Here." Rex let out a slow breath, as if he'd been holding it since Evan Hayes died. Spring came to Briar County the way forgiveness sometimes comes, late, cautious, and in small, stubborn signs. The snow didn't vanish all at once. It retreated in patches, revealing dark earth underneath, like the valley was remembering how to breathe. Water began to run again in the ditches along Ridgeline Road. The pines shed their heavy white coats. And one morning, Ryan Mercer stepped onto the porch of the farmhouse and realized the silence he'd bought no longer felt like a grave. It felt like space. Inside, the house smelled of fresh-cut wood and coffee instead of cold ash. The broken window had been replaced. The roof no longer sagged. The front steps didn't groan in protest when someone climbed them. Ryan had fixed the structure first because that's what his hands knew how to do: repair the frame, reinforce the weak points, make the place hold. Grace Hayes had repaired the rest in quieter ways. Curtains sewn from donated fabric, a small table near the window, set with a jar of pencils and a stack of blank paper, a shelf of books that hadn't been there in winter. The first time Ryan saw flowers in a cup by the sink, he didn't say anything. He only stared a moment longer than necessary, as if his mind was learning a new fact about survival. Rex padded down the hallway with a different kind of purpose now. He still checked the doors, he still listened to the wind, but he no longer carried that constant tension like a loaded weapon. A dark blue harness rested across his shoulders, the patch stitched neatly on the side. Service dog. Ryan had insisted on the harness, not for decoration, for clarity. In Briar County, labels could be weapons. He wanted a label that made it harder for anyone to ever call Rex dangerous again. Grace stood at the doorway that used to lead into a room full of broken beams. Now it led into light. Sun poured in through new windows and spread across the floor like a promise. "They're coming back today," she said, checking her watch. Ryan tightened the last bolt on a handrail. "How many?" Grace's mouth curved into a small smile, still strange on her face, still new. "More than last week." Ryan nodded and wiped his hands on a rag. The first time strangers came up Ridgeline Road after the arrests, Ryan almost sent them away. Old reflex, protect the perimeter, keep distance. But then he saw who they were, veterans with shoulders set like they'd spent years bracing for impact. Older women from Pine Haven carrying casseroles and folded blankets, as if feeding people was the only kind of justice they trusted. A church volunteer with a box of children's books. A teenage boy who wouldn't meet anyone's eyes, clutching a note his mother had written. "Please let him see the dog." Grace had read that note twice and then cried in the pantry where Ryan couldn't hear her. They didn't come for spectacle. They came because the story had gone national, and the lie that had ruled Briar County for years had finally been dragged into daylight. Maya Cortez's article hit like a match on dry grass. It didn't just name Summit Terra Development. It mapped the pipeline. It published the coordinates. It included the confession and the texts that proved Sheriff Dale Hargrove had ordered a cleanup. The county couldn't pretend anymore. Neither could the state. Summit Terra's board collapsed under the weight of subpoenas. Mayor Curtis Bain resigned, then was led out of his office in cuffs on a local news broadcast that older folks replayed like a hymn. Sheriff Hargrove lost the badge that had made him untouchable. And Evan Hayes, Grace's father, was finally called what he had been all along, a man who spoke the truth when silence was safer. But when the headlines faded, Grace and Ryan were still there on Ridgeline Road, with a farmhouse that had become more than shelter. It had become a symbol, and symbols were only useful if you turned them into doors. Grace stood at the kitchen table with a folder of paperwork. "The settlement from Summit Terra's insurance is clearing," she said quietly, "after legal fees." Ryan didn't ask the number. Money had never been his anchor. But he watched her hands. They were steadier now. "I want to buy the adjacent acreage," Grace continued. "Not to own it, to protect it, to keep this place from ever being surrounded by someone else's power again." Ryan nodded. "And what do you want to build?" Grace looked out the window at the valley, the pines, the thawing ground. "A place for people who don't fit anywhere else," she said. "A place where veterans can breathe, where families can come when the world feels too loud. Where someone can sit with Rex and not have to explain the tremor in their hands." Ryan's throat tightened. He cleared it with a rough swallow and said the only honest thing he could manage. "Then we build it right." So they did. They took the main room and turned it into a hall with long tables, the kind you could gather round without feeling exposed. They painted the walls a warm neutral, not bright, not sterile, something that didn't startle tired eyes. They set up a small therapy room off the side with 2 chairs, a lamp, and a shelf of simple grounding tools, smooth stones, stress bands, notepads, a radio that played soft music when the silence felt too sharp. Ryan built raised garden beds outside because growing something was the opposite of war. Grace planted the first seeds herself, hands in the soil, and Rex sat beside her as if guarding the future. And above the mantel where the winter fire once burned, Grace hung a framed photo of Evan Hayes. Not a dramatic portrait, just a candid picture of him smiling with Rex as a younger dog, the two of them muddy and happy, as if life had never taught them fear. Under the frame, a plaque read, "For those who spoke the truth." The first veteran to arrive after the renovations was a man named Lewis, mid-40s, shoulders rigid, eyes hollow in the way Ryan recognized. He stood at the doorway and hesitated, like he didn't trust his body to enter anything that felt like hope. Grace whispered, "He hasn't talked much since Afghanistan." Ryan didn't step forward. He knew better than to crowd a man who was already fighting his own breathing. Instead, Rex walked to the threshold, calm and steady. He sat. He waited. Lewis crouched slowly and offered his hand the way people do when they're asking permission. Rex sniffed once, then pressed his warm head into the man's palm. Lewis's shoulders dropped half an inch. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a miracle with music behind it. It was a small release, like a locked door finally turning. Lewis swallowed hard. "Good dog," he whispered. Grace's eyes shimmered. Ryan looked away, pretending to check a hinge. Later that evening, after the visitors had left and the valley was painted gold by the setting sun, Grace locked the front door and leaned back against it. "Do you ever think about why it happened here?" she asked. Ryan stood on the porch, staring out toward the river valley, where the pipeline once ran warm under snow. "I bought this place to disappear," he said. "I didn't come here to start over." Grace stepped beside him, wind tugging at her hair. "But you did." Ryan nodded once. "Because you and Rex showed up." Grace breathed in, slow. "My dad used to say a house isn't where you hide," she said softly. "It's where you let people in." Ryan's eyes moved to Rex lying by the porch steps, head on his paws, watching the sky turn from gold to gray. The dog's chest rose and fell in an easy rhythm Ryan hadn't seen all winter. "Maybe that's what healing is," Ryan said. "Not forgetting the storm. Just building something that can hold you when it comes back." Grace reached out and touched his arm, light and careful, like she was testing whether kindness would stay. "Thank you," she whispered. Ryan didn't answer with a speech. He answered by staying. The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere down the road, a truck approached. Another visitor, another life carrying its own quiet brokenness. The farmhouse stood solid now, not as a hiding place, but as a beacon. And Rex rose, walked to the doorway, and waited to welcome whoever needed him next. Because some dogs don't just find what's buried, they lead people home.